Okay, since around 2013, I've supported Tottenham Hotspur, a club in the English Premier League located on the northern side of London. I love this team so much that it's honestly a little sad, and for the past few seasons, as they've largely been pretty disappointing and just lost their best player to Bayern Munich, it has been. In March 2023, their manager, an Italian guy called Antonio Conte, left the club after absolutely roasting it in his last press conference, and so began Tottenham's search for their fourth permanent head coach in 4 years, a process that fans like me have gotten entirely too used to. But who would the new guy end up being? Luis Enrique, Julian Nagelsmann, and Roberto De Zerbi all seemed like good fits, but in the end, none of them ended up getting the job. Instead, at the beginning of June, it was announced that Celtic manager Ange Postecoglou was going to be Tottenham's new head man. Now, I'd like to think that my knowledge of the football/soccer landscape is pretty good, but I will admit that I knew very little about Ange at the time of his hiring. I knew that his Celtic teams had absolutely ripped the Scottish Premier League apart since he got there, but Celtic kind of always do that, and Postecoglou was 57 and had somehow never coached in any of the big 5 European leagues. But if Ange Postecoglou was going to be the guy, it seemed like it was worth looking into the kind of manager and man that Tottenham would be getting. I proceeded to try and learn as much about Ange as I possibly could. To my great surprise, what I heard about him and from him directly absolutely blew me away. There's actually quite a lot of Ange-related media out there, also known as Posta content, in the form of podcasts and YouTube videos that he's been interviewed on over the years, and let me just tell you, they're pretty much all amazing. I spend a lot of time filtering through things that sports people have done and said, and I don't think I've ever come across anyone that has the same combination of genuineness and intelligence that Ange does. His inspirational speeches are genuinely inspirational.
You think about the person in your life, as I've always said to you, it could be your mum, could be your dad, could be your brother, sister, uncle, grandfather, partner, friend, coach. Somebody in your life that when you started, believed in you more than anyone else.
Well done, Trent!
So let them walk out with you tonight. That when the opposition are looking across at you, they're not just looking at you, they're looking at what made you.
Yeah, please just excuse me for a minute while I go run through a brick wall. A lot of the time, stuff like that can come across as performative or cheesy, but with Ange, it doesn't, because as I learned, and hopefully you will too, this guy's story is baked into the way that he coaches and leads his teams. And look, full disclosure here, at the time of recording, Postecoglou's time in charge of Tottenham has barely even started, so there's still plenty of time for it all to go horribly wrong. But regardless of how he ends up doing at Spurs, here are 3 big lessons that I think we can all learn and really take to heart from Ange's story. Ange Postecoglou was born in Greece, but moved to Australia when he was a little kid, which is an incredibly important part of his personal story. It may sound a little ironic coming from an American guy, but Australia is not exactly a soccer hotbed, or a place where that sport is even the most popular one. Things like Aussie rules football, cricket, swimming, surfing, and golf are arguably all ahead of soccer on the Australian sports priority list, which, for a kid like Ange, who is coming from a country that is crazy about that kind of football, was a big adjustment. Ange and his dad spent their weekends at the ground of South Melbourne Hellas, a club founded by Greek expats living in Australia after World War II, and a place where both of the Postecoglous could find connection. Ange talks about his father, Jim, a lot in these interviews, and for an immigrant living in a country where he didn't speak the language and only moved his family there in the first place because of a military coup back in Greece, going to matches at South Melbourne with his son was about way more than just football. And largely because of the connection it gave him with his dad, who would wake him up in the middle of the night to watch games that were happening in Europe, young Ange was absolutely nuts about soccer. He joined South Melbourne as a player when he was 9 and went on to represent them nearly 200 times over the course of his 10-year playing career, which included a handful of appearances for the Australian national team. It wasn't exactly the same kind of career path as the players and coaches he idolized growing up, but Ange was making a name for himself in the game he loved, and soon, he'd be leading the team he grew up supporting to back-to-back league titles as their head coach, his first job in professional management. As his career has gone on, Ange has proven that he can recognize talent in places where other people might not look for it, and I think that has a lot to do with his own background. When he went to Celtic, he recruited players that he knew from the Japanese league, like Kyogo Furuhashi, to try and close the gap between them and their rivals Rangers. Not that many other managers would have had the confidence to make a call like that, but Ange knew that guys like Kyogo and Reo Hatate could play, regardless of where they were from. And then they scored 114 goals in 38 games and won the league. Stigma, whether it's about where someone is from or what they look like or whatever else, is a real thing in sports. But Ange is a great example of how good talent identification should be able to see through that kind of thing. He's not afraid to believe in people who are different because he himself is different. And while I would argue that those differences have given him a distinct advantage in certain areas over the years, they've also brought on quite a lot of criticism. Throughout his coaching career, Ange has believed very strongly that the game should be played a particular way. In Greek, it's kato ibala, which translates roughly to keep the ball down. What this means practically is that Ange wants his teams to have the ball and use it to dominate the game, pulling the other team apart with their passing and movement, and not just hooving it up the field whenever they get in trouble. When he was manager at Brisbane Roar, his team won back-to-back A-League championships and acquired the nickname Roarcelona for how good they looked doing it. Postecoglou is committed to this style of play to an almost evangelical extent, and while he obviously wants to win and has won plenty over the course of his career, he prioritizes performance over results in evaluating how his team is doing. This, to me, is one of the things that makes him so interesting, but it's also gotten him in some hot water when results haven't been as positive. In 2006, in his first job after leaving South Melbourne, Ange was in charge of Australia's men's youth teams, and while he was coaching and developing several of the squad members that would end up bringing the senior team a lot of success later on, the results for those youth teams weren't going great. But remember what I said earlier. To Ange, the results that these teams got were not nearly as important as the performances themselves, or how much the individual players were improving, especially at youth level. Ange wanted to completely overhaul the way that the Socceroos set their program up, but not everyone in Australian soccer shared that philosophy. A lot of people, like former Australia captain Craig Foster, wanted Ange to lose his job because of how the teams were doing in tournaments. And in a famous interview from 2006, he told him so live on Australian TV.
Yeah, okay, Ange, but at the same time, that's the second time that you've failed to qualify now. But you can't just point to the players. You've got to take responsibility yourself, don't you?
I'm not pointing to the players, Fuzzy. Hold on a sec. Did you just hear what I said? Am I pointing to the players?
You said it's things over a number of years.
Now, I gotta be honest, I really don't like confrontation, so this video is almost impossible for me to watch without getting super uncomfortable, but just that little bit should give you a sense of how tense things were. Australia didn't renew his contract after 2006, and Postecoglou would have a really hard time getting a job in coaching for a while. Ange felt that his standoff with the Australian FA had made him borderline unemployable. He was 41 and should have been climbing the ladder towards his eventual goal of coaching in Europe, but instead, he was debating internally over whether or not any of this was going to work out. But being a defeatist is not the Postecoglou way. Instead of tweaking his approach or compromising parts of himself to try and make others more comfortable, Ange did what he's done many times over the course of his career when things got dicey. He doubled down. In 2009, Ange was named head coach of the Brisbane Roar, the team that would go on to be compared to probably the greatest club side of all time. And you know how he did it? By coaching his teams to be brave and keep the ball down, just like he'd done at South Melbourne and the Australian youth teams. He did the same thing when he went on to Melbourne Victory in 2012, and when he landed the big job with the Australian national team in 2013, guiding them to their first Asian Cup in the country's history 2 years later. The belief that Postecoglou has in his methods transmits directly to the way that his teams play, controlling games with their possession, pressing relentlessly, and moving constantly both on and off the ball. When it works, it's incredible to watch, and when it doesn't, Postecoglou is the first to take responsibility for it. When Greece's Giannis Maniatis scored this goal in a friendly in 2016, a lot of people blamed goalkeeper Adam Federici for being too far off his line, but Big Ange wasn't having it. That was what he'd been asked to do, and like it or not, Postecoglou isn't going to change the way he manages anytime soon, no matter what you say. But here's the thing, most people do like it, including many of those who've questioned him in the past. Ange has a way of getting his critics to eventually come around, like Craig Foster, who's done multiple interviews with him over the past few years since that infamous interview, and been pretty effusive in his praise too. I mean, I guess that's kind of what happens when you become the most successful manager in the history of your country, but still, a lot of stuff had to happen for that relationship to turn around the way it has. Something similar happened in 2021 when Ange got the job at Celtic. After coaching in Japan for a few seasons, where, guess what, he won another league title, Postecoglou was announced as the new manager for the biggest club in Scotland. But TalkSport presenter and massive Celtic fan Alan Brazil was not all that impressed about it.
Breaking news coming out of Scotland here. The Celtic have applied for exemption with UEFA for Yokohama Marinos boss Postecoglou to manage in Europe. He does not hold the required UEFA Pro license. This has got to be a wind-up. No.
People have been doubting Postecoglou for his entire career, so in the biggest job he'd ever had to that point, it probably shouldn't have been a surprise that continued. But you know what else continued? The winning. The winning continued. With Ange as their manager, playing in the same style that he's been using his entire career, Celtic won 5 of the 6 domestic trophies available to them over 2 seasons. And Alan Brazil had to come out and say in front of God and everyone else that he was the latest in the long line of people who have underestimated Big Ange. Yeah, he's different from most elite coaches out there. His background doesn't really match up with someone like Jurgen Klopp's or Carlo Ancelotti's, but in the right context, that isn't necessarily a weakness, even if it takes a while for the right people to recognize that, which it did. It's hard to ignore the fact that Ange has been managing for longer than a lot of his players have been alive, which begs the question, why did it take so long for him to get to the top? It's not like he hasn't had success, because, as we've established, he's won stuff pretty much everywhere he's been, sometimes to a historic extent. You'd think that in all that time, somebody would have figured out that this guy was a good coach. Tottenham fans were won over pretty quickly by how good of a speaker and communicator Ange is, but a lot of this material has been available for years. Like, this speech that he gave that went viral in 2023 was from before a World Cup qualifier in 2015, way before he ever made it to Europe. This guy has been cooking for quite a while, so why is he just now making it to the highest level? Postecoglou's goal was always to get to Europe, but for one reason or another, it wasn't happening. But instead of resigning himself to staying in Australia or just giving up altogether, he kept moving forward. While he was in Scotland, Ange and his team adopted the moniker "We Never Stop," which referred mostly to their style of play, but also reflected the attitude of the manager himself. "We Never Stop" works for a Postecoglou team because he never stops. Whether it's rejection or criticism or just the regular adversity that comes from leading a football club, nothing slows Big Ange down for long. There's nothing wrong with big-time former players cutting to the front of the coaching line. Pep Guardiola was manager of Barcelona B for like 20 minutes before he got the first-team job, and look how that turned out. But if that's kind of your platonic ideal of what a great manager looks like, then you'll keep looking in the same places that produces those kinds of managers, and in the process, miss out on the many, many talented people who have stories like Ange's. The more I learn about him, the more I realize that not only does the sports world need more people like Ange Postecoglou in it, but also that it's overwhelmingly likely that those people already exist and just haven't been uncovered yet. Top sports leagues are full of players and coaches from the right countries who have the right resumes and say all the right things that we're used to hearing, but maybe more than anything else, Ange's story makes me wonder if any of that actually matters. What if the greatest basketball player of all time is just out there grinding away in a country where they won't get the recognition they need to fulfill that potential? What if the next great football coach looks and sounds nothing like the kind of person we usually associate with that kind of position? This is how stigmas and stereotypes get reinforced, because if you've never seen someone with certain characteristics accomplish something, most people don't have the imagination to envision it. It usually takes someone like Ange Postecoglou to challenge what we think is possible, and to show that things can be done differently if we're willing to open our minds to something different. I'm confident that after several years of doing the exact opposite, Tottenham have finally found a manager that can make my favorite team fun to root for again. The first Australian manager in the history of the Premier League, and one of the first to coach in any of the top 5 European leagues. Postecoglou has the kind of personal humility that can only come from being humbled for a long time, but also the confidence that can only come from overcoming a wide variety of challenges along the way. It's a unique combination of characteristics and experiences that you don't see all that often. One of the only examples I can think of is someone like John Beeline, who, over the course of 45 years of coaching basketball, went from coaching high school to junior college, all the way up to leading Michigan to a national title game and then coaching in the NBA. Not only are coaches like this rare, but when they do make it, they're incredibly easy to root for. I do hope that changes soon though, because as much as I'm enjoying the heck out of having Ange at Tottenham, for sports to evolve into something better, teams of all kinds should be doing everything they can to find the next Postecoglou before someone else does. Hi everybody, this is Will, and I wanted to take a second to say thank you for clicking on the video and then watching all the way to the end credits. It really does mean a lot, and I'm super thankful for a community that celebrates the kind of stuff that I care about. Was it a little self-indulgent to make an entire video about my favorite team's coach? No, of course, but in my defense, he's probably the most interesting and genuine sports person I've come across in a good long while. If you did enjoy the content, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. Till next time, this has been Student of the Game. Bye.